Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Line. I'm pleased to welcome you to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine and to our monthly webinar series, Climate Conversations, Pathways to Action. Our conversation today will be recorded and available to view right here after the event. If you would like to ask questions, please submit them in the Slido box below the video at any time, and we'll incorporate them into the Q&A section of our programming. We also encourage you to participate in the polls that will appear in the same location and to give your feedback after the event in the survey linked above the video. As a reminder, the views expressed in each conversation are those of the participants and do not necessarily represent the National Academies. For today's conversation, our experts will be discussing lessons learned and opportunities for science to support communities impacted by urban fires. It will unpack the range of factors that are contributing to urban fire risk, explore the impacts on health and infrastructure, and discuss how communities can prepare and move forward in the aftermath of a disaster. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Michael Mendez. He is an assistant professor of environmental policy and planning at the University of California, Irvine, an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, and visiting scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He has over a decade of senior level experience in the public and private sectors, including work with the California State Legislature, the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board, and the Sacramento City Planning Commission. His research examines the politics of environmental justice and climate change, as highlighted in his award-winning book, Climate Change from the Streets. Mike, over to you.
Great. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on what part of the country or world you're streaming in. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'd like to thank the president of the National Academies of Sciences for convening this Climate Crossroads initiative, which is quite important in this moment in time to ensure that we have the scientific and rigorous data we need to protect our communities from climate-induced disasters. Also like to thank the staff at the Climate Crossroads Committee for this opportunity to talk a little bit more about this issue of extreme wildfire events when it impacts our communities and that human dimensions as well. For people particularly living in Southern California, the fires in Los Angeles and Ventura counties have affected everyone in one way or another. Either you directly, a friend, a family member, coworker, one of your students, or in my case, all of the above, unfortunately. This webinar will have the hearts and minds of those impacted by the recent fires in California and elsewhere in the world. And through this expert-driven discussion, we will acknowledge that wildfires are not going anywhere. For many people, this crisis is like feeling that like everything is on fire. With that in mind, I want to use my personal privilege as moderator to read a poem from a feminist scholar and environmentalist, Nikita Gill, and it's called Everything is on Fire. Everything is on fire, but everyone I love is doing beautiful things and trying to make life worth living. And I know I don't have to believe in everything, but I believe in that. This quote really underscores this politics of hope in a world where our climate is burning up our homes, our neighborhoods, and even our schools, that we believe in one another, we turn to one another for guidance and a way forward. So thus, living with wildfires is an unamiable reality in our ever-changing climate. However, the best way to cope is to better understand extreme wildfire events and the methods to prepare our communities, and especially those that are most at risk and socially vulnerable. For a little bit more background, for those of you that live outside of California, you may be thinking, I don't live in a fire-prone area like that, so this information or webinar is not useful to me or my family. However, let's look at the growing data and reconsider this statement. Here, my colleagues at UC Irvine in the Department of Engineering in a recent study have found that very high wildfire density hotspots is spreading throughout California, engulfing most of Southern California on data that they analyzed from 2000 to 2019. However, these findings are not limited just to California. Places like Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Texas, Oregon, and Washington, just to name a few, now have an increased risk of wildfires, according to a recent report by Statistia. Bringing it back to California, 15 of the 20 largest wildfires in our state's history have occurred since the year 2000. And 10 of the most destructive fires in California in terms of loss of life and property have occurred since the year 2015, according to state data. So many factors from urban development and poor land use practices to climatic events are contributing to the increasing frequency and severity of extreme wildfires. So today, we will hear from key experts that have experience researching or treating patients in other extreme wildfire events throughout the United States. Their lessons learned will help guide us to think about how we create more equitable strategies of wildfire defense and preparedness for our families, homes, and all of our communities. So thank you for this opportunity. Now I'd like to introduce our two esteemed panelists. The first is Dr. Christine Weidemeyer, who is an Associate Director for Science at the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences and a research professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Colorado Boulder. Dr. Wiedemeyer's research focuses on the identification and quantification of various emission sources, including wildfires and fires in the wildland-urban interface, and modeling the transport and fate of the emitted pollutants in the atmosphere. Christine, welcome. Thank you. And next, we have Dr. Joshua Weil, who is an emergency physician from Santa Rosa, California, which is in northern, just above the San Francisco Bay Area, who has almost 30 years of experience in the field. He has worked in disaster relief nationally and internationally, and in 2017, he himself lived through the Tubbs fire in Northern California, which destroyed his home while he was responsible for directing the evacuation of Kaiser Hospital in Santa Rosa. Thank you and welcome, Josh. We look forward to some of that lived experience. So to start off in our very first act of this three-part webinar, I want to first discuss the landscape. How should we be thinking about urban fires in the context of a changing climate? So I'm going to both ask Christine and Josh to talk a little bit more about their experiences over time researching this topic, and then also to talk about their experience in the Tubbs treating patients in a medical setting as well. So before we dive into that, let's start with the basics. Christine, how do scientists define an extreme wildfire event? What kinds of fires have we seen historically? How and why are fires changing? How do fires affect air quality? So again, what is the difference between a regular fire and an extreme wildfire? And how are they changing over time and affecting our air quality?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. It's great to be here. And I have spent a lot of my career looking at fires and the emissions of fires. So what's in the smoke that is emitted when you have wildland fires? And there's a whole bunch of different air pollutants that are emitted, from particulate matter, those fine particles that you might see in the air, to greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane, and other reactive gases that might do various different things in the air. And we've seen, particularly across the Western United States, that we are having more fires. There's definitely more burned area, and we're having more severe fires. So fires that are burning hotter and burning bigger. We've also seen that fires are burning faster. So across the West, they're burning, many times faster than they did in the past. There's many different reasons for why we're seeing fires and the dynamics of fires, particularly in the Western US, change. One, our landscapes are getting hotter and drier, and the seasons are getting longer. So that is one reason. The other, as I just mentioned, is that fires are getting faster. And those faster fires are also more destructive. And another reason why we're seeing a lot of destruction from fires is because we have a lot more people moving into this wildland urban interface. So moving into areas with vegetation, flammable vegetation. And then when you have people in those areas, you have more likelihood of human-caused ignitions. So power lines, people burning things that might catch on fire and create a fire, cars. So you have different ignition sources, different climate conditions, and then different social and ecological interactions that are causing that. And of course, when we're burning a lot more, you have more stuff going into the air that can impact air quality. So areas that are exposed to wildland smoke, you might see those particles that causes the haze, or you might have reactions that might create other air pollutants in the air that people get exposed to.
Thank you, Christine. That's a great opener to really focus on the changes over the interface between urban areas and these extreme wildfire events, and underscoring that the extreme wildfire event is not your grandmother's wildfire that they experienced 10, even 20 or 30 years ago. These extreme wildfire events have unpredictable behavior and can move between large swaths of region quite quickly, and not knowing how that might affect people downwind, let alone just down the hill. So thank you for that. And it also reminded me, we'll talk a little bit more about the air quality impacts and how that's affecting people's respiratory health and other issues, particularly outdoor workers. So next we'll move on to Josh, and specifically we would like to know, what are the implications of wildfires for human health? If you can address a little bit more on the acute and long-term effects of smoke exposure.
Sure, thanks, Michael. So, I mean, I think people think of the obvious on the short term, which is, during a fire, people certainly suffer from injuries related to the fires, whether they are direct smoke inhalation injuries, whether there are certainly people who suffer burns. On the night of the Tubbs fire, we were seeing a lot of people who were injured, physical injuries like ankle injuries or arm injuries as they were trying to flee the fires. And then in the very near term, we see what we would expect in terms of pulmonary or respiratory issues. People who have asthma are certainly going to suffer exacerbations, people who have emphysema or chronic bronchitis. And those are kind of on the near term. But there are also a lot of other health implications for people during fires and in the couple weeks after, in terms of maybe they lose some of their pharmaceuticals and they may not have access to those. People who have medications that need to be refrigerated, maybe in zones that have no power. People who are on dialysis may not have access to their dialysis centers, or if they do home dialysis, or if they have home oxygen concentrators. These are the kinds of what we call durable medical equipment that require electricity to run typically. And so if these people are housed in shelters or are housed with their friends and they don't have their equipment, there can be significant impacts. On the long term, we certainly see a cardiovascular risk. So people who are exposed to these fires or to the smoke afterwards, it can be considered the equivalent of half a pack to a pack a day of smoking. And so people have increased risk for cardiovascular heart attacks and strokes. Certainly people who have lung disease are going to see increased damage and injury to their lungs. And I think Christine will talk more about some of the particulate matter that we may not see in the air afterwards, but that persists and certainly causes harm. There's risk to women who are pregnant. So we see increases in preterm labor for women who are exposed, and certainly our vulnerable populations are the very young and the very old. But also, Mike, you mentioned people who are outdoor workers. And in the weeks that follow a fire, there's a lot of particulate matter that persists in the air. And so these are populations that people that don't necessarily have the protective equipment that we might prefer. Or, after a fire, if you're working in an environment where you can put filters, in the facilities, or even air conditioning, which does some filtering, you're going to have some improvement. But if you're working outdoors and you're part of that population, you may not have access to those things. I think what's really interesting, though, is the mental health aspects of living through a fire. And so in Santa Rosa, I recently retired from Kaiser Permanente, the Permanente Medical Group. I practiced for 25 years in Santa Rosa. And the Kaiser Santa Rosa is part of a 21 hospital system. And we're one of the middle hospitals in terms of the size of our population. Santa Rosa and Sonoma County, about 500,000 people in the greater Santa Rosa. Santa Rosa is kind of the seat of Sonoma County. And we're a medium-sized hospital. And in the years that followed the Tubbs fire, which at the time was the most destructive and deadliest fire until the next year when it was the Paradise Fire, and now the subsequent fires, every year we just fall further down the list. We became the second busiest hospital from our emergency department from a psychiatric emergency perspective. And so there are a lot of implications for what happens to a community when you suffer such great loss as a community. We lost over 5,000 structures. People were displaced from their homes. People were displaced from their jobs. Some people just said, I'm leaving the community. So we had trouble filling jobs. It's very disruptive to have a major event like this in a community, and it has long-term effects. So this is one of the areas I think that we're still studying and trying to learn and engage more about. But I can just talk from personal experience how living through the fire changed my life, and it changed a lot of things for my family as well. I think the other thing, and you mentioned at the beginning, Mike, how many of your friends, colleagues, students are going through the effects of the fire? But the reality is that for most people, 99% of the people, their lives will go back to normal in a few weeks or a few months. But for people who've lost their homes or their jobs, they become part of a very small group. So I really saw this in my teenage daughter at the time. She was in a relatively small school, and of course, the school was closed for a couple of weeks, and everybody was impacted by the immediacy of the fire. But in the weeks and months that followed, their lives pretty much went back to normal. But there was a small cadre of students who lost their homes, and for them, their lives were disrupted for very long afterwards and ongoing. So they kind of banded together. My daughter had new friends, and I think part of it was just people who could share that experience without having to say anything, right? She had some friends, one friend in particular, who also lost her home that night. And I think they could be together and know each other without having to talk about it. Because she doesn't like to talk about the fire.
Yeah, thank you, Josh, for that. And I've been studying these issues throughout California and Sonoma County and Napa, where you're originally from, and then the Central Coast and Santa Barbara and Ventura counties. And everything that you said really resonates with the research that we're doing with farm worker communities, migrant communities. And a major implication of this research, and many of us here on this call, is thinking beyond property values and really looking at the downscale or downwind type of domino effect from mental health to loss of jobs to even the loss of community, a sense of community for many different people, including children that may have lost the very school that they're going through, which happened here in Altadena. Several schools burned down to the ground, and students spread out the region now, and that sense of loss of not just educational attainment, but community. So next, I'd like to ask one more question to Christine that dives a little bit more into these causes of urban wildfires. And why are we seeing more, and what are some of the risks posed by urban fires? You mentioned a little bit about the land use practices and arson, but a new kind of area of study that people are seeing, particularly in Western United States and here in California, is this phenomenon called hydrochromatic whiplash, where we go from extreme drought, extreme dry, to extreme storms, atmospheric rivers, and too much water that eventually, again, has implications for too much vegetation and fuel for fire. So if you could talk a little bit more about why are we seeing so many fires now?
Yeah, well, like I said, in general, like across the West, we have drier, vegetation. We have more people in and around flammable vegetation. We have changing weather conditions. So we have, examples of really high winds. And those high winds can drive these faster fires that tend to be more destructive. For the fires that just happened in California, it was kind of the convergence of a whole lot of factors. They had back-to-back winters of really high wet winters that really boosted the vegetation and had a lot of vegetation grow up. And then a super dry fall. So all that vegetation had the opportunity to just dry out. And then you had these extreme conditions with the Santa Ana winds. And then, like I said, when you have people moving into these areas of flammable vegetation, ignitions under these extreme conditions for like the Santa Ana winds that were happening, once even a minor ignition happens, if you have these extreme events, a fire can just take off and spread very quickly. So, unfortunately in California, we had these, kind of convergence of all these different factors. And we saw the same thing in the Marshall Fire outside of Denver, Colorado in 2021. That's the neighborhood that I live in that burned and And it was similar conditions where there was an opportunity for a lot of vegetation to grow up and then dry out. And then we had extreme wind conditions that blew a fire straight through several neighborhoods. So, and we're seeing this more and more, just with changes in climate and then changes with the human interactions and where we're moving to.
Great,
If I
thank you.
can I chime in here, Mike? So, so my experience in 2017 in the Tubbs fire. So first of all, there was a fire 50 years earlier. I think it was called the Hanley fire, that covered almost the same area in Santa Rosa. The difference is that in 50 years earlier, that fire moved from Calistoga to Santa Rosa in 5 days. The Tubbs fire moved from Calistoga to Santa Rosa in 5 hours. And nobody really had, the firefighters weren't familiar with that. Nobody really had that kind of experience. And to put it into human perspective, I was working that night in the emergency department. I became aware, I mean, it was a weird night to begin with, and I became aware that there was a fire a couple of miles from my home as the crow flies. And so I called my wife at 1 a.m. and I said, it's a little weird out there. Why don't you just get some stuff ready, throw the computers and the wedding albums into a car just in case. And to hear her describe it, she talks about walking outside the first time and seeing a glow in the distance, walking back in to get some other stuff. And now she could see flames coming over the hill. By the time she had woken up our daughter and brought the first dog out to our car, now there were flames surrounding the house. That fire was moving a football field every 3 seconds. I'm currently in New Zealand, so we'd say a rugby pitch every 3 seconds. And that's the kind of intensity that nobody knew what to do with. And again, to Christine's point, the other major difference between the Hanley fire and the Tubbs fire was all the homes that had been built in this area that was covered by fire and was now covered by fire again 50 years later.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. And really talking about the unpredictable behavior of these extreme wildfire events. And, maybe not in this last fire, but there's been previous fires here in California where we see what they call fire tornadoes. So it's very weird and abnormal type of behavior that the fires are experiencing particularly when two different fires may merge together and increase the intensity. So let's move on, and we're going to move on to Act 2 and dive a little bit deeper into what are the implications of your experience both in Colorado and Northern California, of your experience in the recent LA wildfires. And we previously talked a lot about these issues of hydrochromatic whiplash, our changing environment, thinking beyond property values, looking at pre-existing health disparities and air quality issues. But now I want to maybe ask Christine if you could answer the following. We're recognizing that it will take some time for scientists to fully understand the Los Angeles fires and the greater Los Angeles region. Can you unpack what we know about the climatic factors that contributed to the disasters experienced there?
Yeah, again, there's been a lot of people trying to study what are the probabilities of fire happening, right? And there's a lot going on, particularly in our country, but globally, a lot of these factors are the same. Again, looking at the climate, how dry things are getting, what's the seasonality? Is it getting warmer? Are seasons getting longer? I know in California, there used to be set fire seasons. Now it's 12 months a year, right? And it's getting that way. I mean, we had major fires in October and November just a few years ago, which would have been unheard of, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So we're seeing different fire timing, right? And then we're seeing differences in vegetation. And then again, we're building our homes near flammable vegetation. And that flammable vegetation doesn't necessarily have to be a forest. It can be a grassland. We were right next to just an open a open space of grassland, but because of extreme events, when fires, are moving so quickly, it can just go right through a grassland and then into neighborhoods to catch them on fire. So those are some of the general climatic. Again, there's a lot of work going on to try to understand what is happening and why, and then so that we could better predict and be ready for when it's going to happen.
Sure, great. And maybe if I could ask a follow-up question. I know you mentioned that you have done studies on smoke transport. And in
Yeah.
the multiple fires that happened in 2020 throughout California, it wasn't just LA, near Southern California. It was Northern California, San Francisco Bay Area, the Central Coast, and down south. That fire together, and in Oregon and I believe Washington were also caught on fire, reached not only New York State, but it reached Western United States. I mean, excuse me, not only New York State, Western Europe. So it went across from California to New York State to Western Europe. So do you know if that phenomenon happened with these recent fires? And then maybe you can elaborate a little bit more. Why is the smoke transporting so far away now?
Yeah, well, I guess there's a couple factors. We didn't see so much of that with the recent fires in Southern California just because of the way the winds were going and the local dynamics. So really, the smoke was horrendous in Southern California, but it didn't transport too far beyond a couple of states. But this is one of the challenges that we have as air quality experts is smoke doesn't see political boundaries. Smoke can travel a long way and impact people far downwind. And when you have huge events with lots of fires, you have a lot of smoke getting, emitted into the air, and it can catch the jet stream. That's what happened during the large fires in 2020 is they just got emitted pretty high into the atmosphere and were able to transport, thousands of miles away and impact people far downwind. And so, and then the question is, what is actually being pumped up there? When you burn vegetation, we've done a lot of work to understand what's in smoke from when burning vegetation. So we might see these particles or particulate matter, which we know impact cardiovascular and pulmonary health. But we also have a lot of other reactive gases that can create air pollution problems downwind. And then a really big challenge and really something that I was really introduced to after the Marshall Fire was, when you start burning human structures and cars and all the stuff in our, garages, it's a totally different suite of pollutants that are getting sent up in there. And the impacts, could be very different in terms of health and ecosystems downwind. And so there's lots of efforts to try to understand what exactly is being put up into the air and into our water systems and into our soils after you start burning these human structures and human materials.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And that really turns us to really understanding that those human dimensions as well, not the ecological, quite important, but the human dimensions of how our social and physical infrastructures are affecting our communities. You mentioned water, and the fires that happened in tubs, and then the ones in 2020 as well. Scientists have studied the water 6 months after those extreme wildfire events, and benzene and other carcinogens were found in the drinking water 6 months after those fires. And I would guess that will be similar studies will come out of the greater Los Angeles and Ventura County for the recent fires. Also, you mentioned about that mixture of burning structures, and the research that we did, we often frame it around this toxic soup of toxic air quality that we don't know what's exactly in there. It's burning structures, chemicals, fertilizers, household items, cell phones, electric vehicles, that is mixing heavy metals, it's all mixing up into the air, and people are breathing, particularly the communities that I work with, farm workers, that many of them are that are still working in sometimes in mandatory evacuation zones, and breathing in that toxic soup of poor air quality and how that's affecting their health long term in an acute manner, but also in a long term. So just really understanding, while again thinking beyond property values and the footprint of the fire, that It may not be, that fire may not be right next to you, or you may live on the other side of the country, but there's global implications, regional and global implications of what is happening in the Western United States with these extreme wildfire events. So now I'd like to ask Josh a little bit more about your experience as a medical practitioner and the parallels between what you saw in the Tubbs fire and the greater Los Angeles fires, particularly to the challenges of these fires to hospitals and our healthcare systems.
Yeah.
Sure. So first of all, I mean, I'll just piggyback onto the comments that the two of you just made. In general, so I have a colleague, Dr. Mary Meyer, who is an emergency physician and does disaster work and also is doing a lot of public health work around smoke. And I was talking to her recently, the smoke from these type of urban wildfires is considered to be 10 times more toxic than from typical, forest fires. And the other really, I think, disturbing thing is that public health made great gains in air quality over the last 50 years through a lot of very effective measures. But we've seen a plateau and even a decline in our air quality in the last decade or so, and that's largely being attributed to these kind of urban wildfires. So it has long-term implications for the health of all of us, not just in the communities, but this is the air quality in the United States and the pollutants there. So really significant. And I mean, when I think about, of course, my heart was breaking when I was watching what was going on in Los Angeles. I'm thinking back to 2017. And, from a healthcare perspective and a health systems perspective, these events are incredibly disruptive and challenging to work through. Now, we have a lot more experience since 2017 in particular in preparation and planning and in executing a plan afterwards. But as you can imagine, when these fires go through, one of the first things I think about is that, and this point was alluded to by Christine, but we think that when we live in these urban areas that we are not in a wildfire zone. But the fact of the matter is that Santa Rosa, like Los Angeles, is a community of concrete and lawns, and the fire still rages through and destroys all these structures, right? And people in 2017 talked about, oh, we should have a fire break. Well, the reality is that the Tubbs fire jumped a 6-lane freeway. And so it's kind of hard to know how big a fire break you need to make over a 6-lane concrete freeway, and it still jumps easily over that when it's driven by these powerful winds. So what you see is that you get this tremendous disruption. Facilities are closed if they're not right. We had to evacuate our hospital. That's a whole long story that I tell frequently. But it took weeks to be able to reopen the hospital. Well, there are 180,000 people a year who get their health care in that hospital and the clinics that are affiliated. And similar in Los Angeles, they have hospitals and clinics, and those clinics may be shut down because they lose power. They may be shut down because they have a loss of workforce, pharmacists, nurses, physicians, all the people who support healthcare. So I see a lot of similarities in that. And I think Los Angeles, again, my particular system, the Permanente Medical Group and Kaiser Permanente, has experience now, unfortunately, in managing these events. But there's a lot of parallels that I see in the experience that they're going through now. Obviously, again, you need to work you're going to have elective surgical cases that are canceled. You have women who are in labor and who are going to be delivering babies. They need a place to deliver if the hospital is closed. You have people who need urgent surgeries, whether it's related to cancer. Again, I mentioned earlier, people who need their dialysis, and those things are disrupted. So that kind of supply chain, supplies for actual supplies, but also delivery systems are all disrupted. And so you have to have a plan around how you're going to continue to deliver that healthcare in this now disrupted environment. And so I see a lot of parallels in that in Los Angeles compared to what happened in 2017 in Northern California.
Great, thank you so much. This is great information of kind of seeing the best practices or the worst case scenarios that we saw in these both fires, and that we can find a path forward. And we're going to be moving on to Act 3 of the webinar. But before we do that, I just want to remind everyone in the audience that there should be a link to a Slido deck that you can put in questions. So we highly encourage you to put in your questions that you can ask our panel of experts here when we before we conclude the Q&A or the moderated panel session. We'll go to the audience questions next. So I highly encourage you to do that. So moving on, we want to turn into future and next steps, not just identifying the problems that are happening with wildfires, extreme wildfires, that is, but where do we go from here? How can we safeguard our communities, some of the most vulnerable communities, from outdoor workers, farm workers, to our children, to the elderly, those that have medical devices and are homebound, and most importantly, also equally importantly, as Josh mentioned, our healthcare systems that are already stretched in by undercuts, both undercutting in budgets, but are further exasperated and put to the max during a disaster. So I want to start off with what are some of the proactive steps people or cities and states can take to improve wildfire prevention, preparedness, and mitigation strategies? And Christine, maybe we can start with you on air quality monitoring networks.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that people want to know is when a fire is going on, is what am I breathing? Is it healthy? The US has air quality networks. They're set up to monitor urban air quality, so they're not necessarily in the right places to measure wildfire smoke. Although during the LA fires, there was a lot of monitors that provided some really valuable information. There's also a lot of ways that we can monitor air quality with other tools. One of them is Purple Air. Purple Air is, there are more monitors that anyone can buy to measure particles in the air, as well as maybe some other reactive pollutants. But what's great about them is they have a map that you can look at that has everyone's readings out to find out if your area has bad air quality or not. So there are tools that we can do that to look at air pollution. I was talking to an EPA colleague about this just the other day about monitoring during these fires and how we can really measure so that we can better understand what's coming off of these fires and what's being emitted and what we're being exposed to. And it's really challenging to do that. It can be very expensive if you're really monitoring, trying to look at like all the different things. But there are some simple ways that we could protect ourselves by wearing masks during a fire. There's ways that we could inexpensively clean up our homes after being exposed to a fire if your home is still there, by building inexpensive air filters out of box fans and air filters that you buy for your home HVAC system. So there's a lot of tools out there to help us. I think that we could use to better understand what we're breathing in during a fire, what's there after a fire, and that are available to anyone.
Sure. I'm going to follow up very quickly about the air quality monitoring network. As we mentioned earlier, Josh and I and yourself has mentioned about this toxic soup of air quality. Yeah. We don't know what's in there. Do any of the current air quality monitoring Air Now, Purple Air, cover any like heavy metals or VOCs?
That's a really great question. And when you said VOCs, those are volatile organic compounds. So these are kind of the things that you might smell. Some of them are not harmful. Some are carcinogens like benzene. It's a whole suite of compounds. But there are some really expensive monitoring networks, stations that provide that really high level information. They are few and far between because of course they're very expensive and intensive to run. But you can use some of these less expensive monitoring, like either buy them yourselves or use what you can see online to at least give you an indication of where the smoke might be. And then knowing that it's a toxic soup and it's going to be bad for you, regardless of what's in the air, then you can do things to protect yourself. Again, using filters and masks, or just if possible, to remove yourself from the situation.
Late last month, the California State Legislature passed a multi-billion-dollar recovery legislation that was signed into by the governor as well. And part of that is funding to possibly upgrade what many have called, quote unquote, an antiquated air quality monitoring system to include some of those issues of heavy metals and VOCs. So that's an ongoing discussion. And what other folks that I've been talking to is also expanding that to other sensitive receptors, meaning populations that have pre-existing health conditions and are vulnerable to this toxic air quality, such as children. We saw in this fire in the Santa Clarita Valley, which is just the most northern part of LA County, where a fire broke out. And while the fire was several miles away, a toxic plume was going over the high school, and students were screaming and yelling in the news video of that. So, looking at our different levels of government, including school districts, how they can use these air quality monitorings to make decisions of when to evacuate far ahead of exposure to sensitive receptors like children. So I'm going to move on a little bit with Josh with a similar question on next steps. And you have focused a lot on hospitals and emergency information issues. There was reports during the fires in the Altadena, the Eaton fire, that many of the cell phones went out and people weren't able to access, obviously, internet, power, of course, and then most importantly, cell phones for communication purposes. What implications does that have for healthcare or access to healthcare or disaster resources, and any suggestions on addressing those issues?
Well, that's a big question. And like I said, since my experience in the fire in 2017, and then having to evacuate a hospital again in 2019 with subsequent fires, I actually have I lectured around the country around preparation. So I think there's an aspect of personal preparation, and there's an aspect of healthcare system preparation. From a healthcare system perspective, most healthcare systems, all are actually required to have disaster response plans, and those will include things like communication networks, satellite phones, and other things, which I don't think people can expect to have sat phones at their house. But those are really important to have a network of communication, plans to open up a command center, whether it's locally in the hospital or again in my former system for Kaiser, we had a regional command center, and of course, Northern California, Southern California communicate. So I think a lot of it just comes down to communications and preparation for communications and redundancy and thinking about backup plans. From a personal perspective, I think there's so much that can be done. And I mean, really what I want people to go home from today is to go home and pull out your phone and videotape the contents of your home. So this is your assignment for today. It doesn't have to be very long, but this is related to recovery from loss and having to deal with insurance companies. And you're asked to recall everything that you've had in your home. And so just pull out your phone tonight and videotape your home, and then make it maybe the beginning of every month, go around and focus on one room, so that eventually on the cloud you have a system to help you. But also personal preparation includes having things like a go bag ready to run out the door with when you have 60 seconds with a change of clothes, some expired medications. Expired medications lose a little bit of potency, but they're fine. A pair of glasses. How about a list of important phone numbers? Because when your phone runs out of power, I don't remember my kids' phone numbers. I just know that it's Sydney, Caleb, and Sophie on the speed button on my iPhone. So, Siri, call Sophie. But the other thing that you mentioned, Mike, is that communications can become very difficult because of not only the towers go down, but the whole system gets overwhelmed. So having a plan around what it turns out is it's much easier to make outgoing calls than to receive incoming calls. So people should have plans about a common out-of-state contact. And so for my family, that out-of-state contact, we're in California. My mom and my stepdad live in Washington, D.C. area. So we all know to call Nana. And then Nana can have a list of, hey, Sophie called in, she's okay, and this is where she's located. And so we can communicate that way. So that goes for systems as well, plans around communication. Sometimes texting is easier, but again, if the cell phone towers are down. So having those kinds of backup and redundancy personally and for systems becomes critically important.
Yeah, no, I had not heard about the video documentation of your entire home. That's quite amazing. I do have friends in the Altadena Eaton fire that are dealing with some of those issues, unfortunately. And had they had that sort of record, that would ease with the insurance companies and recovery effort as well. And then this
And of course, it doesn't just, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it doesn't just apply to fires. I mean, tornadoes, floods, whatever the disasters of the community that you live in, this is a critical preparation step that everyone can do tonight. So.
And even if you don't think you live in there and that, a disaster prone place, do it anyway. When the fire came through our neighborhoods, I was like, oh, we live in suburbia. There's no way. I grabbed the dumbest things when we left because I was like, oh, I'll be back later on. And that was not the case. It took me, my house did not burn, but it did take me a few days to get back. So the to-go bag is pretty important as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then just to reiterate, and I have been telling folks, particularly the Public Utilities Commission and other advocates that work with utilities company, the need to shore up our cell phone network and our broadband network, because almost everything, as we know, is on the internet, including disaster relief sources. There's been disasters here in the continental United States and Puerto Rico where power has been out, cell phone service has been out for weeks, if not months. And how do you access digital forms that to get access? Or if you're far away from a shelter for a hard copy, or you're immobile, you can't take your elderly parent, there is quite important. So hopefully, we have some progress in better safeguarding our cell phone towers and our broadband systems, because we're so dependent in not just for emergency information, but post-disaster recovery assistance as well. And then also just really thinking about that go bag. When I started doing my research in Sonoma and Napa, and then hearing about these blackouts and not access to information. And my father is homebound, home dialysis, and has his machine at home. And, we eventually had to get an extra generator for that. But then those are cost prohibitive, particularly if you want a solar versus a gas, which you're thinking about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. But these are things that we as head of households and family members, we must all think about. So thank you for all covering that. So I think we're going to be moving on to the Q&A portion now. We're going to be diving in a little bit more on some of the questions that we got from the audience. So let me turn to that. And the first question is for Christine. What are the tools that help meteorologists or other forecast fire risks? For example, are there tools that map and reflect fuel, slope, availability of water or electricity services, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are a lot of tools out there and information, either from ground-based or satellite, to tell us what's on the ground, what the terrain looks like. We have really much better fire spread models now to predict. There's still a lot of places to go, but I've been really excited about some of the technologies that are being advanced right now. For example, I know there's power companies in Southern California, and they have cameras set up across different landscapes, and then AI ability to predict when and where a fire is going, and then understanding of the meteorology and modeling the meteorology to know if and where a fire is going to spread and go, so they can respond quicker or turn off power quicker so that fires don't get started. We have a lot of new tools to understand the probability of a fire starting, whether it's the dryness and the weather, all these things combined, where the likelihoods of fires might happen versus where not. So that, for example, if we know that one area has a higher probability of a fire happening because of the climatic conditions and then the weather conditions and where people live, we can deploy our resources better than we could if we didn't have that information. So there are a lot of really great scientific tools. A lot of it is still in research. So I think seeing it get more translated into applications, which is happening now, is pretty exciting. And I think we'll have more and more tools, and we'll need it too, because like we said earlier, this is happening more and more.
Great, thank you. And I think we'll follow up momentarily on issues related to like artificial intelligence, but I want to jump to a question that was for Josh. What are the biggest health research questions we have for the larger urban infrastructure fires that we still don't have answers for. So what are the big health questions for you in this context of wildfires?
So, of course, so research is not my area of expertise, but when I think about where we've been and where we're going, and understanding the long-term health implications. So I mentioned kind of anecdotally my experience in mental health in the outcomes from fires, but I think there's still a lot of research to be had. It's unfortunate that we get more and more subjects to be studied after many of these fires. So you can imagine now that researchers are looking at the communities in Southern California and the Los Angeles area, pregnant women, children with respiratory disease. They'll look at rates of asthma in children. These things take years, obviously, to be better defined. So we're really trying to understand the health implications. And I think an area that has really come into more focus that you've mentioned, Mike, is people like, Sonoma County is an agricultural community. We have a lot of agricultural communities where people work outdoors, and it's not just ag workers. I mean, there are plenty of people who just part of their routine day is being outdoors. So what are the implications and ramifications for people who live outdoors? But also, I think one of the areas that's coming into focus is, again, going back to hospital systems. Just when we have more and more of these hot, dry days, I was an administrator for my hospital in addition to my clinical responsibilities, and we started to have to deal with the climate control in our operating room. So when we get these really hot days and we get more and more of them, then the ability of our HVAC systems to be able to maintain appropriate climate for operating rooms becomes really difficult. And then when the grid is under threat for increased power usage, then hospitals have to rely more and more on their backup systems. So these are areas of research too, not just for the fires, but for climate in general and the impact to our healthcare systems.
Can I just jump in there too? There's a lot, we know that there's health outcomes when people are exposed to the smoke that's created when you burn these open structures, but we're not exactly sure what components in that smoke are actually causing the negative outcomes. And particularly, so I think there needs to be a lot of research to really understand exactly what is in the smoke and what is causing the harm and how it's causing the harm. And I think there's a lot of work to be had there, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree with you. And not knowing what is in that toxic soup, again, it was research has shown that smoke from wildfires can be several times more harmful to human respiratory health than vehicle exhaust. So we all know that if you stand next to your car and you're breathing in the exhaust from the tailpipe, that can get you sick. And if you're in a close space, you can even die. But that research from I believe it's out of UC San Diego, Aguilera, and her co-authors really highlight that wildfire smoke is several times more harmful from the exhaust from our cars. So, going on to this, what Josh was talking about, these HVAC systems in school and hospitals, we also are asking children to shelter indoors during these wildfires and the toxic plumes. And we have a lot of research that shows the underfunding in terms of facilities, including HVAC systems, air filtering systems, and our deteriorating schools. So that sensitive receptor populations like children are being more and more exposed. So we need to have policies to understand when should we be evacuating students well before they get sick. And then I want to follow up on Josh. You did mention about heat and wildfires. As we know that we can have a compounding of disasters happening. We can have a wildfire event, a drought, and an extreme heat event all at one time, which we had these compounding events in California. And research and news reporting has shown that the healthcare system has a difficult time tracking or medically coding when people are suffering from heat illness or death. Do we see similar difficulties in tracking illness and death from wildfires and wildfire smoke?
Well, one of the things that I think is interesting, and again, I was just discussing with a colleague some of the data that's coming out of Los Angeles in terms of emergency department visits. And some of the early data suggests that there was an increase in the percentage of things that we would expect, asthma, emphysema, cardiovascular events, but an overall decline in visits to emergency departments. And part of that is because people just get displaced. So I was having this conversation. So as you can imagine, lots of people will leave an area where there's a fire, and so they're going to go seek care in other emergency departments. They may be with relatives in Northern California. They may have left the state. Certainly, they may have left the area. But the other thing that gets significantly underreported, and again, we kind of, when I talking with my colleague, kind of realized that there were some 2,000 visits and care delivered in shelters. And this was my own experience in Sonoma County with Red Cross. A shelter was opened up in the county, and my coworkers and colleagues, nurses and doctors and pharmacists, went to go staff the shelter and gave direct care to people there who were maybe having eye complaints from the smoke or were having respiratory that didn't require transporting them to the emergency department, but they were getting basically what they would have sought at an emergency department delivered at a shelter. So there's a lot of underreporting of those types of visits and that kind of stress in the system. So recognizing those alternate care sites where people are getting their care delivered, and recognizing that we're probably under-collecting, underreporting that kind of data.
Would you believe, and the reporting and studies have been done about heat and healthcare systems, and again, not adequately displaying the data or coding it in terms of medical billing and the other methods in which healthcare professionals document impacts from heat, illness, and death. Similarly for wildfires and wildfire smoke, do you think there needs to be a greater education and best practices for the healthcare industry to better identify the relationship?
I think it's a great point. I think especially if we want to understand the long-term outcomes, then we need to collect appropriate data. So I mentioned that, on the night of the fire, I was seeing people with ankle injuries related to escaping the fire. Well, I didn't code that as a fire-related injury. I coded it as an ankle sprain. It's actually a kind of a funny story. When I received the frantic call from my neighbor, he was just shouting at me, "Get out, get out, get out." He didn't know I was at work, and I was evaluating a woman with an ankle injury, and I read her X-ray as no break, but because I was looking at her ankle, and I missed the injury in her foot. She had broken a toe or something like that, and she forgave me. She was very understanding, but I did not code that as a fire-related injury, and so but it certainly was related to the events of that night. And so yes, there's obviously an opportunity for education. I can also just tell you that as a physician who codes visits, and you rely on systems to direct you, and if you don't choose the right words, then the diagnosis you seek may not be there. And so sometimes it's just finding the right words. So if the words and the language aren't available to us to begin with, then we're not going to capture our thoughts completely.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And those public health and medical researchers that have worked on extreme heat and to better educate the healthcare industry and be reflective of how extreme heat is affecting them, I hope they hear your comments and they also start looking at wildfires and smoke as well. So, Christine, I have another question for you. And it goes, how can you balance the benefits of greening of urban areas to decrease extreme heat and the urban heat island effects, as well as improving air quality with the possible increase in the risk of development of fires? So essentially, as we are trying to cool down our concrete and hard surfaces in urban areas because they're all concrete and hard surfaces, and making it several degrees hotter than a green vegetation area, we plant trees and other types of green spaces and parks. That's cooling down our neighborhoods from extreme heat, but at the same time, the person is asking, is that making us more vulnerable to the risk of wildfires, and how do we balance that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Just a personal observation. When we drove through the neighborhoods that burned where I live after the fire, the homes were burned to the ground, just concrete left, and there were still standing trees, which I thought was just shocking. Why the trees didn't burn, but the homes did. I think that's something we need to look into, but I don't necessarily think that greening our urban areas will make us more vulnerable to fires, only because I think we can be strategic about what vegetation we plant, and so some might be more flammables than others. We can also build and plan around our structures so that the structures are still protected. This is called like hardening our homes, making them more fireproof. So we could have vegetation all around our homes, but the homes are protected from fire because of what we do to the home structure itself. So I think we do need to be thoughtful and not plant really, really flammable materials close to our homes or in, certain ways, but I think we can have a really good balance between greening our urban areas and still keeping them fire safe.
So don't plant chaparral or sagebrush right next to your home, right? Which,
Maybe not,
yeah,
or make sure it's watered.
Or eucalyptus trees, to California, as opposed to native California oaks, which are very fire resistant.
Exactly.
Yes,
And
because the former, like say eucalyptus tree, sagebrush, and especially sage, chaparral, they have oil in it, and they get dry, and then they pop literally, and the oil spreads and it catches on fire.
yeah.
Okay, so Josh, I have a question for you. There have been reports from providers of presumed low level carbon monoxide poisoning among evacuees and rescuers in urban wildfires. Given its effect on decision making, navigation, etc., and lack of protection from filtering mask respirators, is there any useful guidance on this?
Well, I think, this goes back, it's a great question, and it goes back to education and preparation. So, one of the challenges in medicine in general, and in emergency medicine in particular, is if you don't think of the diagnosis, you won't make the diagnosis. Now, this happens to be an opportunity, I think, for AI going forward in medicine to help us. There's no way. I remember, traveling through Europe and thinking about the Medici brothers who were, physicians and composers and musicians. But of course, their knowledge that they needed to know for medicine was a good bloodletting and some leeches. And now today we have so much information, so much knowledge that we're required to be responsible for that it's impossible for anyone to remember all those things. So AI has an opportunity to remind us of potential etiologies for someone's complaints. But again, education is a real opportunity for people to learn about managing disasters and what are the risks. And certainly carbon monoxide exposure is one of those things that probably is underdiagnosed because you may not think of that as the cause of someone's headache if you don't look for it. And then long term, we know that people who smoke cigarettes have long-term exposure to low levels of carbon monoxide, and that has implications for their health and the components of their blood, the percentage of hemoglobin and things like that. And so that's another area of research is what does that short-term exposure from things like smoke look like?
Great, thank you. We have about 6 minutes left, so we might be able to get 2 questions in. So the first question, we have heard a lot about air quality. What about the contaminants in urban water runoff? Are there techniques for trapping pollutants in the water before they reach the streams and our drinking water? Are there ways of monitoring the influx of contaminants into streams or reservoirs?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's really beyond my expertise since I'm an air person and not a water person. But I do know that's something that is looked at after these fires in my neighborhood and elsewhere, because we know when you burn either, stuff that can leach into the soils and then leach down into our water systems, there's concerns about the smoke getting into our water filtration systems and our water plants. And also when that smoke gets lofted up, it often comes down somewhere that can impact water and soils. So I can't speak to how we prevent it from getting into the water systems. I can speak to our need to make sure we monitor it and to look into the soils for, metals and carcinogens like benzene and other compounds. But I can't speak to the length of time that we need to monitor or nor how we prevent it from getting into our water systems.
Yeah, and I had mentioned before research, and I just looked up his name, Andrew Welton at the University, Purdue University, studied the Sonoma wildfires and its impacts to the water systems and drinking water. And in that research, he saw that benzene and other types of contaminants were in the water system 6 months after, and even showering in that contaminated water could have skin irritations. And speaking of which, Josh, could you elaborate a little bit more of what can these contaminants do to people from the public health perspective, and when the contaminants get into our water from wildfire debris?
Sure. So, I mean, I think the biggest thing is we know some of these are, as you mentioned, are carcinogens. So that means that there's a cancer risk. So the longer the exposure, then there's a cancer risk. And again, I think particularly in children and vulnerable populations who have a lifetime more to create a complication from these exposures. And then I think there are also, this is another area of research is, there are chronic gastrointestinal conditions that can develop from some of these exposures or chronic joint pains and things like that. So these are areas of still a lot of unknowns, right? Because we're really gaining, again, unfortunately, we're gaining a larger and larger population of people who've been exposed to these things. And so these are areas of research. So some of them are known, like carcinogens, and some of them remain to be determined.
All right, thank you.
I will say, for example, in our neighborhood, we did some monitoring of the soils after the fires, and we didn't see elevated contaminants, but that could have been the way that the fire burned and just the number of structures and how things went. Whereas in LA, we might see something different. So I think it's going to really be specific to the fire and the event, what we should be looking for and what the contamination might look like.
And we know that, for instance, children whose parents smoke have higher rates of respiratory diseases like asthma, but they also have higher rates of upper respiratory infections like pharyngitis, sore throat, otitis media, ear infections. And so I think we can expect that some of these same results come from exposure to the smoke from fires.
Okay, thank you. So some of these we have some really great questions, but some of the questions I don't know if you can answer. I might be able to highlight some of them, but please jump in. One interesting question is there work to prepare training for fire specialists, such as those within a municipal fire department, how to evaluate fire risk as these risks are changing, ideally as a service to homeowners. So, from the urban planning perspective, which I'm in the Department of Urban Planning and Public Policy, there was a very interesting article that came out in the Los Angeles Times of actually the city of Irvine that was seen as a model for the entire country in terms of how the municipal government is working with the city planning department, public works, and specifically the fire department, where the fire department for new development, new projects come in and does an assessment for fire risk. And you must get that permit and sign off from the fire department that this new development project or this new rebuild of a home is meeting certain standards for fire resistance and fire preparedness. So I think that's a key avenue that cities should take and fund staff positions for that fire personnel that can do these assessments and fire risk.
Most definitely. We're seeing that in Colorado as well.
Yeah, maybe if do you have anything to add? Like,
No, I just, I've been recently talking to people at the Boulder Fire Department here where I work, and they're working with local planners to understand fire risk, recognize how to harden homes to make them less vulnerable to fires. And they are working with the city. I think they should be working with HOAs. There's opportunities to work across communities to prevent fire risk.
yeah, and our prep. Oh, go ahead, Josh.
I was just gonna say, I mean, God love public health people, because if you do your job well and you prevent injury and harm, then everyone says, "What the heck were you doing? Nobody got hurt." And if you fail to warn people somehow, or don't intervene strongly enough, then they say, "What the heck? You all these people died because you didn't do your job well." So it's like it's a no-win. And what we saw in Katrina was that the people who were most likely to fail to evacuate and subsequently be harmed or die were people who had survived previous hurricane events in their lifetimes. And so they said, in 1970 they told us to get out of the house and nothing happened. And so why am I going to leave now? And those are the people. So it's kind of human nature to have experienced that. And so how do we work with our municipalities to communicate to people, to be proactive? I mean, that was one of the big differences between our hospital evacuation in 2017, which was very reactive, as opposed to 2019, which was proactive. And the whole community was much more proactive in 2019, so that the fire systems could focus on saving homes and protecting and stopping the fire, rather than just saving lives and getting the people the heck out, which is all they could do in 2017. They couldn't worry about stopping the fire. They just had to save lives.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then maybe staff, if you can find that Los Angeles Times article on the community in Irvine that's doing all these fire safe practices, building materials, having buffer zones between development, I think that'd be helpful in the follow-up interview, because there's a lot of questions about building materials. And I think we need to end the Q&A pretty soon, but I want to have the last word of our two panelists. First, a closing statement, but also we have, at the beginning of the call, we had 8% federal workers, 16% state and local government, 32% academia, 14% nonprofits, 14% industry, and 5% media, and 11% other, whatever that may be. So you have a great audience here that if you would like to provide a closing statement, and then perhaps one recommendation, if you were talking to any of the policymakers or the advocacy nonprofits there, what would you advocate for, budget-wise, or a new policy or law, possibly?
Do you want to go first, Josh, or do you want me to?
You got the mic, so go.
Okay. Yeah. So I just want to reiterate that, we're having more of these fires in the wildland urban interface. And we really, even if we don't know everything that's being emitted and from those fires, we do know that they're harmful to our health, but there are lots of ways that we can protect ourselves. Either through, inexpensive ways, by monitoring the air quality using networks that are already existing, by wearing masks, and then we can have and build our own inexpensive air filters, both during a fire and after a fire, that could be really effective. So there's a lot of things that people can do to protect themselves personally, and then also to work with the communities to harden homes and make sure that you are as resistant to fire as possible. And I also want to just reiterate to make sure that you have your to-go bag. I don't care where you live or what kind of community you're in. I highly recommend it. Just some really key essentials that you would want to have should you had to evacuate quickly.
Thank you. Josh.
So, so first of all, I guess what I would say is be proactive rather than reactive. And so that goes back to the go bag, but also beyond that, like I mentioned, filming your house, having that, part, having a list of phone numbers, because your phone may be dead and you're going to be borrowing someone else's phone. Beyond the go bag, have a list next to the go bag of what you would take if you have 15 minutes to prepare for evacuation, or 2 hours, because You're not going to remember some priceless artifact that your grandmother gave you that is tucked in a drawer somewhere unless it's on a list that says, hey, you've got 15 minutes, grandma's ring is in the drawer in the bathroom. So those kinds of things, because you don't have time to think and your brain doesn't work the same way in an emergency as it does day to day. So that kind of preparation, but also preparation around plans, whether, with your family, where are we going to meet? If we're separated, who are we going to call if we're separated? But that also goes to the community in terms of planning. And I think my message would be around communication. So when I called my wife in 2017 to say it's a little weird out there, she called a neighbor and the neighbor said, oh, we got an evacuation order. Well, we hadn't gotten that. So you reverse calling on cell phones, communications through apps. I mean, I don't know anybody in Sonoma County who doesn't have the Watch Duty app right now, which is an app that it's free. I'm not advocating any particular app, but it's available to monitor fires. It's a blessing and a curse because you hear about every fire, but then the curse is you hear about every fire. And so, these are the kind of planning and preparation steps. So I think being proactive rather than reactive is my message today.
Great, thank you. And then as moderator, I'll take the privilege just to reiterate an agreement with everything that this expert panel has said, and in particular, again, that major research implication, thinking beyond just property values, thinking beyond homeowners, the able-bodied, and including special needs and functional needs populations, children, the elderly, homebound individuals, outdoor workers, farm workers, and others that are sensitive populations that need extra care. So particularly if you're in state or federal government, the need to build those relationships ahead of time before the next disaster and incorporate them into your plans and policies and procedures to be able to reach and connect to these hard to reach populations. So thank you to the National Academies, to the Climate Crossroads Initiative, and I'll hand it back to Laura. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for moderating that important conversation. And thank you, Christine and Josh, for sharing your experiences and perspectives. After our prep call, I started assembling my go bag, even though I live on the East Coast, so really appreciate that advice. I really want to thank our audience today for your interest, excellent questions, and for sharing your thoughts on preparation via the Slido app. We read all the feedback we receive from our viewers, so please take our survey or email us at climatecrossroads@nas.edu with your thoughts or reflections from today's programming. The conversation was recorded and will be available to view on the same webpage immediately after we end. If you found the webinar informative, we also encourage you to share on social media. If you haven't already, please register for our climate newsletter or follow us on LinkedIn to get updates on all things climate at the academies. Our March conversation will look at the importance of native seeds, which I think we touched on a bit today, in preserving biodiversity and addressing the impacts of climate change. Keep an eye out for the registration link in our newsletter. And finally, as always, a big thanks to all the National Academy staff who are working behind the scenes to make this possible today. Take care, and we'll see you again in March.